So this is the huge elephant that is already in the room and we don't want to see it.
People expect to be treated fairly, that societies benefit from being more equal.
When we have to achieve something new, when we want to come up with the decision that will bring us to another area, that's great to find out where we differ.
Empathy helps make us more human.
The diversity is the fact.
Good afternoon, I'm Łukasz Lipiński. We are at British Council Debate. We're going to discuss diversity, openness and inclusiveness. We have very distinguished guests from Britain and Poland whom I will introduce in a few moments. But let us start from the beginning. Some people might say that you work better with people who are the same like you. Same language, same mindset, same religion or ethnicity. Why diversity? What's your experience? What does it bring, let's say, to the workplace?
Actually, there is no evidence that homogeneous teams are better than heterogeneous teams. At the same time, the evidence is inconclusive around diverse teams, but I think it's strengthening. There are lots of examples of homogeneous teams, so teams that are the same in a range of ways, getting things awfully wrong. But set that aside, I think that there are very sound business reasons, very sound moral reasons and very sound legal reasons, and both our countries are governed by European legislation as well as domestic legislation that supports inclusion.
What are the business reasons then?
I think businesses have to respond to the external environment and to an increasing reality that people expect to be treated fairly. That's an expectation. Gone are the days when you could work people to the bone, do whatever you want to them. People don't expect to come into organisations or attempt to come into organisations and be discriminated against because of an attribute that you can't change. I think that businesses realise that actually they can enhance their brand by promoting diversity. They can extend their customer base by thinking about diverse customers and the different customer needs, and there's some really powerful stories about that. The Dove campaign, the big campaign, was based on them using real women, women with real body shapes. They had not looking like supermodels and of different ages, with freckles on their face, all of that. And it is said that as a result of that campaign, which spoke to people, which was a very positive campaign, they increased their profits by 500%. That is what is said. I've even heard 700. Another example is, I remember many years ago I was working with somebody from Ford Motor Company. And Ford Motor Company said that they'd been assessing the spending patterns and buying patterns of various groups. And they worked out that women were increasingly major purchasers of large items and decision makers around how significant amounts of money were spent in the household, moving away from a man hands over a pay packet. And so they were trying to develop cars that had safety features that were particularly attractive to women and particularly met their needs. And there are countless stories like that. Stories of when you get it right, and stories when you get it wrong and how it damages your brand. But the World Gallup poll survey that was done several years ago highlighted that actually companies that have a strong inclusion policy, so take equality, diversity and inclusion seriously, are more likely to release the discretionary effort of their staff. So the staff are more likely to go that extra mile. You know that if your business has a strong reputation for inclusion, for fairness, for not exploiting young people, you know, by unpaid internships, you're going to attract talent and you're going to have a wider talent pool to draw on.
That was the British point of view by Dr. Fiona Bartels-Ellis, the head of Equal Opportunities and Diversity at the British Council. And now we'll turn to Polish examples. Pani Dominika Cieślikowska, psychologist, trainer of intercultural and anti-discrimination skills in Poland. So about Poles, we used to think that we are a pretty homogeneous society. I mean, well, I know
We
it's
are not, and we never have been.
it's a stereotype, right? But everyone says, you know, most of the people are white. Well, most of the people are nationality Polish. Most of the people will have the same or more or less the same religion. What's your take on that?
Yeah, when we are talking about the diversity in this concept, in this particular concept as a business concept to be developed in organizations, we really consider very often, but not as much now as it was even before, this identity lenses. So we are talking about the people as women and men, or transgender person, as Polish person or Polish or person of different origins, coming from different ethnicity or different nationality. But what about the mixed couples with having kids and so on? So it's really a complicated story. And this is why I laugh when you said that we seem to be homogeneous. We have never been, and we are not, and we will not be. Because from the psychological point of view, like all the people are similar and different at the same moment. And it's not a slogan for me, for myself. It's really like it is. I mean, there are different moments where we have to come up and find out where we are similar for certain reasons. For example, for having quicker into the decision, because having people thinking similarly helps us to have a quicker decision to be made, because we don't have to argue, we don't have to consider many different points of view. But when we have to achieve something new, when we want to come up with the decision that will bring us to another area, that's great to find out where we differ, because only then we will find out this sphere where we could find out something new about ourselves and find out extra idea. For many years, during my trainings, I was underlining that we are different, because we seemed that we are more similar. And to be honest, many identities in a Polish context were neglected. We didn't want to see transgender person. We didn't want to see LGBT community. We didn't want to see people with disabilities. So many people were not taking part in a serious public debates. They were not influential enough in companies, and their perspective was somehow neglected, forbidden to be open. But nowadays I'm considering a little bit like kind of a shift in our discussions when we are working within the teams, because with the younger generations, but also with people who somehow acknowledge the differences, there is also now a moment to underline similarities. Because we now already know there is a huge debate also about, I don't know, a few years ago we started huge public debate about refugees. And what was done, the whole differences were underlined. So there is now a moment also to come up to the point where we are similar, to be able to meet each other, to cooperate, and not to be polarized.
Because you work with businesses, with government on these issues, with people. Have you noticed that, because in Poland the issue of diversity never was like a first prime time issue actually. Have you seen that it has been changing in, let's say, recent years?
The debate about this and also call for action is increasing, because first of all, in my opinion, it's because the women who are really fighting for their position, and this is the group of the people who started to really call and show the others where the diversity lenses are important to be acknowledged. The LGBT community is also quite powerful nowadays and is trying to put some light on the issues that are really trying to be silent. I would say that the refugee issue became also a kind of hot issue, and refugee is one, and on the other hand also the immigrant issues, like we really need people who are working in Poland, coming from different backgrounds, and we have to somehow acknowledge and learn how to cooperate and how to be together as the co-workers, as the neighbors, as people having kids together. So there are different life domains now affected by finding out that we are, naming that we are diverse.
Let's switch to another issue of implementing diversity in your companies, businesses, other institutions. It's easy to say, it's even easy to write in the law the legal obligation. In Poland, for example, there is a legal obligation for public institutions to employ a certain percentage of disabled people, and actually most of the heads, or at least many heads of this public institution, decide to pay hefty fines not actually to do that, because employing them would mean some problems with rebuilding, refurbishing, and so on. So if law doesn't work, how can you do it? I mean, what are the best way to make people implement the ideas of diversity and anti-discrimination in the places where they work or have businesses?
The diversity discourse often focuses on different aspects of identity, key aspects of identity. I think most of us working in the field see diversity as broader than that, thinking styles, you know, and beyond, personality types and beyond, and thinking about the business benefits of leveraging those, and some very, very powerful work being done in relation to that. But if you do just get caught up in the identity elements, there is a problem. At the same time, I do think that it's important to focus on the differences that make a difference to your opportunities, to the treatment that you receive, all of that. And so that takes us to the implementation element. I think it varies for organisations, you know. I think organisations have to work out, well, what's the problem they're trying to fix? What is it they're aspiring to, and why are they aspiring to that? So if you have a good representation of women, but actually the senior level doesn't reflect that overall representation, I reckon that's a problem that you need to be attentive to, because it seems bizarre to have a lot of women working there, and then they're not at...
It's quite often in companies in Poland.
Yeah, that's often the case. Or disabled people who are at entry-level jobs, or restricted, as they used to be, to particular roles, or the situation you explained, which is common in many, many operating environments. You know, the British Council is in over 110 countries. We're an international cultural relations organisation, and we take this area very seriously. And we're not saying we're perfect, but we know that in a lot of operating environments, the requirement to fulfil a quota, in that instance, not a target, of disabled, and that's a contentious space, quotas or targets. People just respond to it by paying the fine. That, you know, that's not implementing. You know, that is a tokenistic, undefensible position. So I think implementation has to be informed by the sort of business you are, the particular issues that you're confronting, the aspirations that you have, so your intent. And of course, implementation needs energy and will behind it. And, you know, leaders are crucial in that. Leaders say do something, people often respond to it, because, you know, we're talking about issues of power here. So I think implementation is hard. This area is full of rhetoric and wordsmithing. And too often these words are nicely written down, there's nothing underneath them. So I think you have to be proportionate. You know, at the British Council, we've decided to focus on 6 main areas of diversity. That's not the picture of diversity that we recognise. It's much broader than that. You look at our equality policy, we talk about 15 grounds or other irrelevant grounds. But you have finite resources, you're thinking about, well, the differences that make a difference to life chances, opportunities, all the rest of it. In our case, kind of globally. We know globally that there are huge problems for disabled people, huge problems for sexual minorities, huge problems for women, huge problems on the lines of religion and belief. And actually an area that's not given a lot of attention is age. That's another of our areas, and of course race, and race has a broader definition that includes ethnicity, nationality, national origin, skin colour. So those are our 6 main areas of focus. And if you look at those different areas, they're different issues. One of the things in terms of implementation that I think is very important, and the British Council thinks is very important, is actually to disrupt this approach, this reactive approach, to try and be proactive, to anticipate where you might unjustifiably discriminate. And how do you do that? You do something that we call equality screening and impact assessment. So you're proposing something, ahead of implementing it, look at it, interrogate it, and see what the potential negative impact might be for different groups in relation to the policy. An example, a local authority in the UK was implementing a change in their refuse collection policy. And what they said was that everybody now was going to put their refuse in a central bin space, because they didn't want the refuse people going around collecting it from all the flats and all the rest of it. And so they sent this out for consultation, which is part of equality screening and impact assessment. And, you know, people raised the issue about, well, you know, kind of, what about disabled people? They were able to. And they said, oh, yes, we've thought about that. And they said, well, what we've decided is we'll have a different colour bin bag. We'll issue them to you, and you'll put it outside and they'll be collected.
Right.
On the face of it, you think, maybe a good idea. What disabled people said, look, you might as well say, put on our door, vulnerable person here.
Yeah.
You know, kind of. So, you know, when they consulted, it was possible to avoid all the resources and the upset and the hassle with the knock-on effect of that. Another local authority was developing a leisure service. And, you know, the community looked at the plans, and typically, you know, they'd had the same number of toilets for men and women.
Yeah.
I mean, really?
Doesn't work.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work, and it's nice you as a man even acknowledging that. So in terms of implementation, if you can take an anticipatory approach, if you can slow down, if you can bring some rigour to your decision making, that's great. And so that's one of the reasons why, as part of how we implement, we do quite a lot of work in the area of unconscious bias internally, and we're happy to share that externally as well, because, you know, the unconscious bias space is about slowing down and bringing more rigour to your thinking and decision making, so you can strip bias out of it. So in terms of implementation, there is, of course, that's your space. There is, of course, the education, the, you know, the learning, the understanding how bias creeps in. There's all of that. There's a whole policy space as well, developing policies that are fit for purpose. There's a whole piece around reward, making sure that in rewarding people, you are being equitable in the pay and remuneration for men in comparison to women. You men, as a generalisation, can negotiate harder than we can. as a generalization. So, you have to take account of that and have to realize that the problems can arise if you're not looking to ensure that your gender pay gap is not increasing. So, it's being attentive to the learning and development piece, being attentive to your policies, your human resource policies and your other policies. So being both proactive and mitigating, but thinking about, well, what are the issues that are particular for your organisation? For our organisation, we've got a good representation of women, not as good as we would like at the top. A good representation in our UK workforce of minority ethnic people, not a good representation at the top. Poor representation of disabled people. We have to do much more to attract and retain disabled people. So a way of changing that is to see what we can do in terms of making adjustments to the role, attracting people, making sure that at the interview stage there are reasonable adjustments made, or we like to call them adjustments made, all of that sort of space, and using the data. Because without the data, how do you know that you're progressing?
Fiona just said you need energy, will and leaders to make a change. How does it work in Poland? Do we have...
And law as well.
We need law, but we started that law doesn't work.
It's a very important framework, to be honest. I remember the meeting, Fiona is looking from the perspective of the organization that has policies implemented to a certain point, really. Very often I'm meeting the organization that are at just starting point. They just introduces their diversity policy. I remember one opening the meeting, the whole week of diversity within one company, and it was the big event planned to be open for welcoming like more than 100 employees. And there were actually at the meeting there were only 8 women who came. So I saw the HR managers were like kind of a disappointment. They were showing me that maybe we will cut off a little bit this meeting, not like facing this kind of disaster from their perspective. But after 10 minutes, they realized, I saw their eyes opened so much because those 8 women of different backgrounds. It was not only the issue that they were women, but one of them was Ukrainian, another one was a single mother. They all had such an important inner motivation to be there, and only because the policy or the law was introduced for the first time in their company, they had a chance to meet each other and to discuss such an important things that they shared, that they had in common, that they really wanted to fight for. And as I've heard later on, after 1 year, they were like really the advocates of the diversity within the company. The implementation is a process. It's a process. And you really have to have these 2 approaches. So the laws and the policies are really important. If you don't have to, from so many perspectives, you don't have the starting point or referring point. Only if you have them, you can really meet people, group them around these ideas and find out people who really are eager to be involved and share their own experiences very often, or the experience of other close people to them, and name the issues and work for it.
What do you think about the, let's say, level maybe not of education, but awareness in Polish society of these issues?
With the gender issues, we've done a lot, really. This is something that when I'm looking back at the starting point, when we had really to name very basic mechanisms or the very basic processes or like very basic issues for discrimination, women and men discrimination depending on the life area. That was like eyes opening for people at that time. Nowadays, you know, there are so many people who are already, I'm not saying that they are implementing or that they are agreeing, but the level of awareness is, quite high. So we can move on with different areas, with different topics. There are different forces that help us or stopped us from talking, from being aware. But when I'm working at schools with very young kids, first, second, third grade, it's amazing how aware they are of the diversity in many spheres. They are watching different movies, they are reading a bit different books, they are listening different stories. Our job is not to somehow destroy their much more open attitude. The research shows that with age we becoming more racist, more homophobic, more closed, let's say, generally. Because the official program of education does not support such messages. But people looking at their surrounding, at where they live, they see the diversity.
Sometimes people say in Poland that if you speak about, let's say, about immigration, when you deal with an abstract issue of immigration, then you tend to be against. But if you meet people like coming from there, and you have a neighbor from Syria or from Ukraine, then everything's fine. Then it's completely. Then you treat the things completely different when you have concrete person, concrete family, and people who are living in your neighborhood. Does it work?
The contact hypothesis. Yes, to some extent it
does that work, or the other way?
Not only, because when you meet the person who is really in some way different than you, speaking different language, and you cannot communicate, doing something differently than you do, and you don't know what the person is doing, and it puts you somehow in danger. For example, is talking with a very loud voice, which is culturally shaped, and you are not used to, you might be afraid. So the message, this is why the education is also important, the message that support that you don't have to be afraid, that you can try, that you can check, and that you don't have to be afraid that you are afraid also, because this is why the contact hypothesis, it works, but only to some extent. There has to be some surrounding that will help you to analyze, understand your feelings, and what is going on in the dynamic of this contact.
We've touched the issue of migrations or immigration. I think in recent years it was central to this issue. I mean, immigration was central to discussion on Brexit in Britain. Immigration, this is the biggest thing which happened recently in Poland. I mean, during the last 2 years or 3 years, we've had around 1 million or even more people coming to our country. How much does it change thinking on diversity in both respective countries? I mean, for good, for bad, how does it go?
The reality in the UK is that we've always had immigration, and we've had a history of going to other countries as well and colonizing those other countries, and in those times not feeling that was a problem. And I think a lot of people in the UK are very concerned about, and I'll speak about Poland in particular, because Polish people are, I mean, it's awful to talk in these terms, but Polish people are very well thought of in the UK as a generalization. You know, the concept of model minorities, you know, some minority groups are, some ethnic minority groups are said to be the model ones, the ones that are lauded and upheld, and others are not. And so I think it depends which immigrants.
Right.
Some immigrants are welcome and other immigrants aren't welcome. And often a determinant is your skin colour. And I think, unfortunately, politicians all around the world have played on this and used it as a tool. At one time in the UK, the politicians of 3 of the major parties signed a pledge not to use immigration as part of their campaigning, not to use it in an abusive way as part of their campaigning. But I think Brexit is already confronting us with lots of challenges. At the same time, I think it's legitimate to talk about how much diversity can a country take. Yeah. You know, the UK is a very populated country for its size, 63, 64 million people. London, where I live and work, is highly, highly populated. You have to get underneath what the concerns are about immigrants. And I think there's something called displacement. And I think, we should be more attentive to supporting immigrants to build their social capital and to recognise the role of social capital in all of this. The thing that worries me about this discourse is that it actually doesn't address the structural level. Mm-hmm. It gets to the very personal level. So I move in next to you and you're then worried about whether the house prices are going to go down and how it very much affects you personally. And sometimes, at a leadership level, those things aren't dealt with responsibly. But, the reality is that inequality is damaging. It's damaging to societies, it's damaging to individuals. You pit individual against individual, you create a lot of fear.
What about Poland? I mean, on one hand, immigration was used instrumentally by politicians. On the other hand, we are witnessing more and more immigrants working in Poland. You meet these people in shops, in other areas. Does it change Polish society? Ukrainians, mainly Ukrainians, but not only. Many people coming from other countries, mainly to the east from Poland. Does it change Polish attitudes towards diversity, or it doesn't? Or it's too fresh?
I think both. To some extent, it brings more fear. To some extent, it brought more examples where people were able to cooperate and to do wonderful things. I think that this process has to be navigated. It's a really complex issue, and nowadays we deal very often with a very highly complex issues as never before. Because it's the reasons why people are moving, the whole mobility of people is now influenced by so many factors. It's not only economical. This is the identity, this is the peace, this is the climate changes. So many new factors that all together are bringing us to the very complex situation. And my fear is that we want to apply two simplified solutions that was taken from the past into much more complex situation. We have to be much more creative in navigating, in establishing the frameworks, both systematically, institutionally, and individually. It's not that simple, and that is, if we want to come up with very quick response to the reality, we want. The process has to be navigated. My personal contact with somebody from the different background has to be navigated. I have to learn, I have to get advices or the frameworks how to do this. And on the same level, the leaders, they are also brought in a situation that the more consultations coming from much more diverse, broad specialization has to be taken place. We are taking the past concepts into the nowadays reality. We are still in that, because we were the country that, and still there are more people leaving Poland than coming to Poland. And there has to be really a shift, mind shift of the whole framework, and we have to think differently and really address more complex issues.
If you would like to tell a single most important thing, or maybe two things which you want to our viewers to be left with on why diversity is important, what would you sort of finish the discussion with?
One of the things I would like to say is being concerned about diversity is important for all of us, and I'd like to illustrate it through a comment that somebody called Bert Massey, who headed up an institution, said, and this is in relation to disability. A lot of people feel otherized. This is all about the other, nothing to do with me, they're taking from me, this is an irrelevant conversation, just get rid of them or don't let them come in. But of course, diversity is about a whole load of areas, and I just want to pick on disability. So he said, disability is an open club. Hang around long enough and you'll be a member.
Yeah.
My son said to me, you could say the same about old age. Old age is an open club.
Yeah.
Hang around long enough and you'll be a member. So it's not something out there, actually. So take a pause. Take a pause in your response to fairness, in your intolerance of other people, of your intolerance of difference, I would say that. And I would say that we all have intolerances. So it's not a question of getting on a guilt trip, it's a question of trying to do something about it. And then I'm somebody who believes that empathy helps make us more human. I think there are all sorts of reasons why we don't develop empathy. And I've seen the devastation, actually, that unfairness can create. I've worked with young people, black young people, who've been trying to scrub their skins white. I worked with a little boy who wanted to be white, desperate to be white. And I was asked to do some work with him. And he said to me, he was 6, and he said to me, I've got a plan, Fiona, I can be white. So I said, what's that plan? And he said, he'd worked out about the scabs coming off. So he said, I'm going to jump in a fire and burn myself all over, and then when my scabs dry and I pick them off, they'll be white.
Terrible.
Terrible. Now, you know, it's very difficult to be empathetic sometimes, but actually this concerns us all. And our respective societies and societies all around the world, if you look at the work of academics, emerging work, tells you that societies benefit from being more equal. The greater the divide between the haves and the have-nots, the greater the suffering for all of us in all sorts of ways.
The diversity is the fact. We cannot say that there is, it's like an elephant in a room. The diversity or the diversity issues are very often in Polish language connected with the problem. I've just heard in one organization, oh, we don't have the problem with some of the LGBT person. There is a problem with Roma. We have a problem with the problem of. So this is the huge elephant that is already in the room, and we don't want to see it or call it as a problem. While for me, this is already the reality. Each of us is different in many ways, and I cannot believe how we will not acknowledge it, name it, and try to live with it, learn how to live with that, with the whole of the respect, instead of like creating problems. We are not creating diversity. The diversity is already here, always was, and it will be.
So what I noted from that each of us is different, and empathy makes us more human. I think we'll stay to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.